Hello, everyone. Now this would be the beginnings of my Abenaki history video, but apparently this is going to have to turn into an Abenaki history playlist more than anything because it seems Abenaki is not necessarily a real term to describe Native Americans, and that is kind of a weird thing to come out and say, especially when you have like so many tribes have names and that they're known by in English that are not their real name anyway, and we don't get annoyed at those. But this covers like a large culture group, and comes from a confederacy. Essentially, there were several smaller nations about the Abenakis, the ones known officially as the Abenakis, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, who banded together into a super confederacy to protect themselves at some point during the colonial period, and that's actually where the term of Abenaki comes from as a coverall. But at that, we then need to kind of take care of the rest of these groups. So the first group that we really have are the Micmac, who kind of controlled a lot of the coastline and the island territories directly up the coast east of Maine, plus a lot of the islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, like Anacostia and Nova Scotia, and a little bit of the northern coast along the edge of the Gulf of St. Lawrence originally. So this is actually like a very unique and interesting group of people. Overall, they had a very distinct kind of dress, which you don't really think about when you see Native Americans, and especially when they usually do like Native American things these days and dress Native American. They go what we call Pan-Indian, which is kind of a whitewashed format, taking like headdresses of one tribe and clothing of another and weapons of a third, and kind of random face makeup and kind of mixing it all together into just kind of this movie styled version of an Indian, and it's not even remotely close to what these people actually wore. For instance, I mean, these people would normally in their day-to-day lives go around wearing light shirts and a skirt with a beaded belt, and a lot of kind of jewelry around the neck and on the arms, and a variety of different hairdos. They actually developed this idea that's completely unique to them, which is the styling the hairdo to denote kind of your occupation and your skill level at that occupation. And they even had like special hairdos that people wore for weddings that are kind of still somewhat practiced today from a cultural standpoint, and would normally just kind of move on to like a heavier cloak for winter. And there are like different styles of clothing for different occupations. There are kind of chiefs and shamans and even kind of court stenographers who have different styles of dress, to even alongside the different styles of hair, to denote who they are in a professional capacity. And how these groups kind of work, well, supposedly an unknown period in the past, you have the Iroquois peoples. That culture group comes out of Canada in this massive war effort, expanding east along both sides of the shores of Lake Ontario into Abenaki territory. They had developed agriculture, and they developed permanent settlement and fort building, and were kind of had turned to war and expansionism and become very powerful. And in return, the Abenakis borrowed some of their ideas of agriculture and borrowed some of their ideas of government, causing them to become equal in the meantime, where the Iroquois were settling into their newly acquired territory before moving on to the next. And once they came to equalize, the Iroquois peoples kind of lost interest, and in that they even seceded from the original empire, creating, as far as we can tell, at least 4 different nations, possibly more than that. The ones that we know of as the Iroquois, one known as the Tobacco Nation, another known as the Neutral Nation, and the Huron, on the north shore of Lake Ontario. At least we assume it was the Huron that was there. We really aren't sure, but at the very least we assume that they were related to the Huron, or the Huron may have been one of them who moved. I'll worry about that when we get to Iroquois and Tobacco Nation and all of the rest of those, but right now we're on Abenaki. And so the way that they had borrowed the idea of law and power is that they created several small tribal districts, and these small districts each had their own leader, their own chiefs, led by kind of a very small council of the chief and the shaman, and a couple of other upstanding members, and then those people banded together in a confederacy, with all of those chiefs working together as one singular nation, one singular society, where they met on an island outside of what is today the modern day city of Cape Breton, which, if you have not been aware, Cape Breton gained a lot of prestige a few months back, because they made a joke. They wanted people to move there, so they made joke commercials saying, well, it's okay, if Donald Trump wins, you can move to Canada and to Cape Breton, and we'll give you a job and you can start your life over and everything. God, that's probably completely filled up with Canadians, immigrants by now, but anyway, the Micmac controlled this easternmost territory, and although they still kind of kept a somewhat semi-nomadic living style, they still kind of moved around to different areas within that acquired territory in different times of the year for different resources. And that's kind of how they had lived for a long time. Of course, the Micmacs, because they lived so far east, and so they had so much insulation of so many other nations against the Iroquois, in case the Iroquois decided to continue to commit war and take territory, they really kind of lost interest in the whole society, and they split off, which is assumed primarily because their language is the most divergent from the rest of the Abenaki languages. But anyway, you have the first contact in 1497 with John Cabot. His real name being, he was actually Italian. His real name was Giovanni Caboto. I guess back then a lot of people used to change their names depending on what country they were in, so they would fit in better. They wouldn't get hit with xenophobia or something. I don't know, but this guy was a terrible sailor. He had petitioned to Christopher Columbus to recommend him for this voyage to the New World, citing in the letter that in his first voyage they went the wrong way, his crew confused him, and then they ran out of food and he had to go back. And given that the first resource other than that first letter is not really recorded in any way, shape, or form, and on top of that, we don't even know where he made landfall. We assume it was on Nova Scotia, but people really have no idea where the heck this guy ended up. But that was kind of the first point where whites meet the Micmac and develop a close relationship with them. Over the next several decades, fishermen would start trawling this region, looking for kind of the best places for fish, and working with the tribes to find those places, and also kind of trading with them. And the Micmacs would, along with several other tribes, would allow the people to set up camps on shore to cure the fish, so they could to cure and preserve the fish, so they could take it back to their territory and sell it, and it would last long enough to get there. But the second contact, of course, was Jacques Cartier in 1534, and shortly after that, the Micmacs and most Abenakis are hit with their first epidemic of disease. And these kept going. The first is in 1564, and the last is in 1758. And they just kept getting racked with disease after disease after disease. We know there was smallpox involved, we know there was influenza, but even going deep into Colonial Era, some of these were just not documented enough to even know what the disease was that struck them, and it got pretty bad. The same diseases also spread among the Iroquois, although the Abenakis were not hit as bad as the Iroquois. Along the northern shore of Lake Ontario, the Iroquois were completely destroyed because of their permanent settlement idea, whereas the Abenakis were still semi-nomadic. Essentially, they would stay in one settlement until the disease had wiped out too many people, and then they would move to the survivors would move to the next settlement, bringing the disease with them there, and it just kept wiping through all of these people until there was almost none of them left. We really know very little about those people, the Northern Shore Iroquois people. But the Abenaki people continued to survive, and we just know that in 1604, presumably somewhere in Maine, we have the first settlement by France. And this settlement does not last the winter, but the following year, a second settlement opens up in Micmac territory called Port Royal, and most of the survivors move there, and that settlement manages to survive. And they named this kind of region around Port Royal Acadia, which it's still known by as today. And of course, with these people, we know that at least one of these epidemics damaged their control of Nova Scotia and the islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence enough that northern tribes who had not yet had contact with the whites, who were not yet familiar with and ready for what was about to happen, moved down and claimed that territory for themselves in violent combat. Of course, we have the colonial era continuing through, and people, mostly at first, people are moving to the Atlantic coast for religious freedom. They don't want to be persecuted in their own countries for their specific sect, like the Puritans and the Jesuits in France, and many other groups were coming to this continent. Although, as more and more of them, they developed very close relationships with many of the natives, and the natives were okay with them being there at first. But as more and more of these settlements managed to cling to life and survive because of the influence of the natives, the idea of opportunity for a new life in the new world gets warped, and more people start coming for reasons other than religious freedom, for job opportunities, just to get away from people, to escape crime. And they begin expanding beyond what the governors can control into places that they weren't supposed to be, and violating treaties with natives. And this starts pissing natives off, and furthermore, they try to go over these people's heads to the governments of England and France and these other countries, and finding out that those leaders don't care. In fact, it's European law at this point that if you are not Christian, you cannot claim land. And they even started trying to convert natives to Christianity, and the natives who chose to convert would be given priority over the natives who refused. And things continued on like this until we hit what we call King Philip's War in 1675 to 1678. Essentially, and this is the beginning of the Wobanaki Confederacy. King Philip was actually a Native American. He was the leader of the Maliseet Abenakis, and he got so angry at the way that they were being treated by whites, this creates the first armed conflict between natives and Europeans. He manages to get all of the different confederacies, as I told you before, the Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and the Micmac, to bind together under him as the Wobanaki Confederacy to commit war against England. And they started joking that since he went by the Christian name Philip, when he was dealing with whites, people started jokingly calling this King Philip's War. And that is kind of what it eventually ended up being. Now, I'll try and get more in depth with some of these wars because it impacts so many different native groups and native tribes in separate videos, but I'll just kind of get over the basic points. Obviously, King Philip does not win, and out of this we get the Wobanaki Confederacy. And the problem, though, is that over the next 100 years, we end up having 7 more wars leading up to the American Revolution. There is kind of a dry period where we have about 20-some years of peace, but it does not last very long. Essentially, England starts settling territory claimed by France. France starts doing the same to England in response. And then they start trying to attempt to use the natives. Essentially, after the Wobanaki Confederacy gets formed, they decide they're going to convert the Wobanaki Confederacy to Catholicism and use them. And England laughs this off, thinking that it's silly and it's never going to work until it starts working, and then they obviously go to the natural enemy of the Abenakis for help, the Iroquois. And they don't do such a good job of convincing the Iroquois that they're friendly and they're allies, but they do get the Iroquois on their side, and this begins to set things up for another major event in New England that is known as the Beaver Wars, where several different surviving native groups went to war and obliterated each other over an attempt to get as far away from whites as humanly possible so they could continue to survive as they always had. And unfortunately, this gets them as far as Ohio, and it does not work because whites follow them almost immediately after they get there, and eventually they just run into other more powerful tribes. It just does not work out. But anyway, so the France and England also start wars against one another in Europe, sweeping up a lot of their allies into the war, like the Netherlands and Germany and several other countries that don't exist anymore. Apparently, they're now merged together into the nation of Italy. There was Portugal was involved, and France and England used this war as a blind so they could try and do more stuff in the colonies and hope it would go unnoticed, or by the time it was noticed, it would be too late to do anything about it. And this is kind of the period where they start opening up tons of Catholic missionaries all through the state of Maine and into the state of New Hampshire, I believe. I know they claimed most of the state of Maine, but I don't know how far they really went. But well, of course, then we go through King William's War and Queen Anne's War like this, and then after that, we then find out something really bad about those missionaries. Not only were the French converting natives to Catholicism, which one native chief, I believe he may have been Micmac, he may have been something else, I don't know. He converted to allow his people, he converted to help his people, and made a big open show of it, but secured the right that his people could practice either religion, their own or Catholicism if they so chose, so that they would continue to have their rights. And this is where the thing began to, the religion thing began. But not only were the French converting the native Abenakis to Catholicism, they were paying the preachers to kind of essentially brainwash them into deciding to enter open conflict. And that's where we enter in 1722 to 1725, the conflict known as Drummer's War, or Father Rail's War, named after one particular preacher, Father Sebastian Rail, who literally took part in the armed conflict, where essentially the Wobanakis literally went to war with the English colonies to try to gain control of it. I don't know if they thought they were doing it for themselves, but the obvious point was that France was going to claim this land once the English colonists were driven out. And it really does not work out at the end. Obviously, the Abenakis are defeated, and most of them flee. Of all of these tribes, the ones that were in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, all of those groups who were left fled north into Canada, going to the St. Lawrence River, the land that is now uninhabited because of largely uninhabited because of the decimation of the Iroquois up there, and now, of course, the cities of Quebec and Montreal have been settled. And the governor of Quebec, I believe, petitions to create little city-states where all of these remaining Abenakis can survive, which became referred to as Odanak and Wolanok, and these are essentially the first instances of Native American reservations in the New World. They are today considered Native American reservations for the Abenaki people. But of course, this whole mismatching of tribes and people is kind of what leads to things later. You heard me getting annoyed at the book by Joseph Laurent that I have, the Abenaki and English Dialogues, because of how he claims Abenaki culture is confused, it's uncultivated, their language is in endless variety because no one's teaching them how to speak it correctly. That is why there was multiple nationalities of people on those reservations. It had nothing to do with anything like that. But anyway, even though you have that, most of the Micmac territory was in fact in Canada, in what was still Canadian territory, and with all of these wars, England managed to claim a pretty large swathe of it, all the way up the coast. But many of the Micmacs who had converted to Catholicism stayed right where they had always been, right around Port Royal and Acadia, and now that they were Catholic, the white settlers were really open with connecting with them. There were interracial marriages, and these groups merged together seamlessly into a single society of one faith and one mind. The English, of course, they try to they managed to take control of this land, and France ends up ceding it to England, which confuses and annoys the Micmac. They petition the leaders of the French royalty and French court, trying to understand how and why this could happen. And of course, they're told, well, your ancestors were not Christian. The first Christian people to discover your land were us, so we own your land, and now England took it over in war, so they own it. And although to keep the peace, England does say that they're going to allow the people to have say in what happens. They're going to be peaceful about this, although they do not keep this promise. In 1749, they establish on the opposite side of the coast of the island from Port Royal the city of Halifax, claiming it as a Protestant settlement and making like a big fuss, trying to drive lots and lots of Protestant Christians to live in Halifax to try to overthrow the balance of the religious sects in that region, and it pisses off the local people, and you get into what is now known as the Micmac War, which is kind of the last point that the Micmac really have anything to do with history, or any time that they themselves are surrounded by history and really make a major impact on it. But obviously they lose, but they manage to keep their rights. I believe it's somewhere in this point where England decides to resettle Canada in a different way, where they're going to have the French Catholics in one area, the English people in another, and or I don't know if it was then or after the American Revolution, because after the American Revolution, many loyalists who didn't want to stay in the United States moved to Canada, and most of those people were English. So, but that is how it generally ends up. The French Catholics stay in one place, the English Protestants in another, and it pushes the Native Americans further and further west and out of the way. And that is pretty much the end of what I can tell you about the Micmacs. They still survive today. They still have their own reservation outside of Cape Breton. And of course, at some point, I don't know when, but a lot of native people did return, and a lot of Abenakis actually never even left. It was assumed in 1800 that Native Americans had gone extinct in this region, especially the Abenakis. They believed Abenakis had gone extinct, and that was not true. Those people had simply adopted into white society, and now that they had white clothing, white jobs, white religion, white people literally could not tell that they were Native American anymore. And these people kind of stopped even thinking of themselves as Native Americans, and they really didn't even come to understand it until the 1970s, when there is again this big resurgence of attempting to return back to Native culture. I believe a lot of those people still have not been given Native status, but they're part of kind of the reclaiming effort of trying to reclaim Native religion, Native language, Native culture altogether. And but anyway, I'll get into some of the other groups. I'll do separate videos to cover some of the wars in more detail. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this.